On a quiet September afternoon in 1996, 15-year-old Danielle Childs left her home in Belgrade, Montana, and was never seen alive again. Her disappearance triggered a local search effort that grew more desperate with each passing hour. Days later, a shocking discovery near the Gallatin River would turn a missing persons report into a homicide investigation. What followed was a decades-long silence. No arrests, no suspects, no answers. But in 2021, an unlikely breakthrough emerged from a lab thousands of miles away. Using DNA preserved for over 2 decades, forensic specialists uncovered a hidden trail that led investigators to a man who had never once appeared in the original case file. What they found would rewrite the entire story and bring the case to a dramatic and irreversible conclusion. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us.
Danielle Marie Childs, a 15-year-old high school student from Belgrade, Montana, lived in a small town west of Bozeman. She lived with her family in a residential area near the local high school and was known among classmates and teachers as a friendly, inquisitive, and thoughtful person. She studied at the Belgrade Secondary School, where she was in the 2nd grade. Her academic performance was steady, and she participated in school activities, although she did not take an active part in extracurricular programs. Teachers remembered her as a respectful and responsible woman. Her friends described her as quiet but loyal, with a small, close-knit group of peers. It was reported that she was not involved in any disciplinary incidents or known risky behavior. Danielle's home life seemed stable. She lived with her parents and at least one sibling in a home where there had been no previous calls about law enforcement intervention or reports of domestic problems. Danielle never ran away or got into risky situations. She had no criminal record, and there were no open Social Security or absenteeism cases involving her. On the afternoon of September 21, 1996, Danielle was last seen leaving her home. According to numerous confirmed sources, she planned to go for a walk, or perhaps meet someone in the Cameron Bridge Road area, in the countryside by the Gallatin River, known as a common vacation spot. It was not uncommon for local youth to visit the area for fishing, walking, or socializing. However, no eyewitness accounts have been confirmed that she met anyone that day, and her family has not been informed of her exact destination. Danielle did not return home that evening, and the next morning, her family reported her disappearance to the Belgrade Police Department. At the time of her disappearance, she was dressed in casual clothes suitable for a warm September day. She did not have any personal belongings, such as a wallet or backpack, with her. Her bike, if she used it that day, was never found. Early attempts to find her included searching for local law enforcement and volunteers, including patrolling along roads and wooded areas near the river. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, and her status remained missing for several days. Law enforcement agencies interviewed friends, classmates, neighbors, and family members. No one reported receiving any messages from Danielle after her disappearance. Her school records confirm that she did not attend any classes after September 21st. Her name and photo were circulated in local news outlets and flyers posted throughout Gallatin County. Tips were received, but they did not lead to reliable observations. After several days of no contact, investigators began to suspect that Danielle might have been the victim of a crime. Her family reiterated that she had no reason to run away and left behind all of her personal belongings. A statewide warning was issued, and local law enforcement coordinated with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. Despite these efforts, no significant leads were found immediately after her disappearance. At the time, the case did not receive much coverage in the national media. Local media have consistently provided updates, but without a body found, a suspect, or physical evidence, the investigation has stalled. The case remained open, but was inactive due to a lack of leads. The local sheriff's department distributed annual reminders in an attempt to get new clues. Danielle Childs' name was eventually added to databases of unsolved cases, but her whereabouts remained unknown for several years. On the morning of September 27, 1996, 6 days after Danielle Childs was officially reported missing, her body was found in a remote wetland near the Gallatin River in Gallatin County, Montana. The site was located near Cameron Bridge Road, in a sparsely developed area characterized by open fields, coastal thickets, and minimal residential activity. The region is located northwest of Bozeman and less than 10 miles from Danielle's hometown of Belgrade. The discovery was made by a local resident who came to the area for a personal vacation unrelated to the investigation. Noticing an unusual presence in the water and bushes, the man immediately left the area and contacted the emergency services. Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies were the first to arrive at the scene. The area was protected for 45 minutes, and access was restricted to authorized personnel. Officers initiated standard killing protocols, including perimeter cordoning, forensic photography, and systematic documentation of environmental features. The body was about 40 feet from the riverbank, partially submerged and hidden by tall grass and cattails. Initial assessments by officers who arrived at the scene revealed no visible signs of fighting in the immediate vicinity. No tire tracks, dragging marks, or unusual ground disturbances were observed. Portable GPS was used to record the coordinates of the recovery site. The victims' remains were dressed, although they were not accompanied by any personal belongings. No wallet, ID card, or shoes were found nearby. Officers noted that vegetation had grown around the body parts, suggesting that it had remained in place for several days. Water levels in the wetlands have dropped slightly since the date of Danielle's disappearance, which may have contributed to the delay in visibility and subsequent discovery. Initially, identification was based on physical characteristics and a description of clothing provided by family members. The items matched the clothes Danielle was last seen wearing. Due to the condition of the remains, the forensic medical examination was accelerated. Within 48 hours, the Montana State Forensic Laboratory in Missoula compared dental records and officially identified the body as Danielle Marie Hutchins. The autopsy was carried out by the State Forensic Medical Service. The official report established that the death was murder. The specific means by which the murder took place have not been disclosed to the public. The relevant sections of the autopsy report were later edited in a version published for media inquiries and public records. However, it was confirmed that no firearms or related shells were found. The resulting injuries were described as intentional and incompatible with either natural causes or accidental injury. Toxicological testing was also conducted, but the results were not included in the final public release. Following an initial forensic examination, a full forensic team was dispatched to the recovery site. Soil samples were taken from below and around the remains. A water sample was taken for analysis for trace contaminants or foreign biological material. Several hair and fiber samples were removed from the victim's clothing and surrounding foliage. These items were catalogued, registered according to the chain of custody, and taken to the State Forensic Laboratory for preservation. In 1996, DNA testing options were limited, and none of the samples matched the FBI's Joint DNA Index System, CODIS. The materials were stored in cold rooms to await future technological developments. There was a lack of infrastructure in the vicinity, such as surveillance cameras or roadway monitoring systems. This place was not very socially active, and there was no commercial real estate nearby. Law enforcement agencies examined private homes within a 2-mile radius. Officers interviewed landowners, ranch workers, and local utility crews who had been working in the area during the week after the disappearance. No one reported seeing Danielle or any suspicious persons or vehicles. One of the property owners recalled hearing a car noise late at night on September 21st, but could not give a description. Sightings have been recorded, but cannot be confirmed.
At the time of discovering the information, the Belgrade Police Department had transferred full jurisdiction over the case to the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. The Montana Department of Justice was also notified and sent a liaison officer to oversee the progress of the case and interagency communications. The case was immediately covered in the bulletin of Montana law enforcement agencies, and then in the regional media. Flyers, media reports, and community bulletins have been distributed for weeks. No real suspects were identified. On October 3, 1996, the Sheriff's Office held a public briefing confirming the discovery and classification of the death as homicide, but declined to provide further details. Between October 1996 and March 1997, more than 100 public reports were received on the case, sent by hotline, mail, and anonymous community messages. Each clue was recorded, checked, and studied. None of the information obtained led to the identification of the suspect or material evidence. The researchers compared these versions with existing records, but were unable to identify any effective versions. The clothes found on the victim were sent for fiber comparison and hidden fingerprint testing. The results were inconclusive. Soil samples and environmental swabs were preserved, but no further evidence linking the scene to a specific person or object was provided. Despite extensive fieldwork, investigators have not been able to determine how Danielle arrived at the scene, whether she was transported by car, whether there was a murder scene, or just where the body was left. By the end of 1997, the case had reached an impasse. None of the suspects have been named, no one has been arrested, and the initial evidence has been fully processed using existing tools available to law enforcement. In early 1998, the case was marked as inactive. Physical evidence, including all biological samples, was officially archived. The materials were stored in the Montana State Forensic Laboratory, under climate control conditions, with full documentation of handling and storage protocols. The dossier remained available to law enforcement officials only upon special request.
Between 1998 and 2019, the case was officially dormant. However, periodic internal reviews were conducted by the Gallatin County Unsolved Cases, a small unit formed in the early 2000s to oversee unsolved serious crimes in the region, known witnesses. A recommendation was made to preserve all biological materials and wait for the development of forensic technology. Following the success of several high-profile unsolved cases using forensic genetic genealogy, Gallatin County Sheriff Dan Springer authorized a reevaluation of Danielle Houchin's case. 4 biological samples collected during the initial extraction in 1996 were selected for extensive testing. The sheriff's office partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a private DNA firm with experience in law enforcement genealogy cases. The samples were reprocessed using next-generation sequencing. This marked the beginning of a significant breakthrough. In 2021, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office initiated a retrial for the murder of Danielle Houchins using advanced DNA testing technology. This included a formal collaboration with Parabon Nanolabs, a private laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy. The goal was to extract and analyze previously archival biological samples collected from the victim's body in 1996. Among the surviving materials were multiple strands of hair. Earlier trials were inconclusive due to technological limitations in the 1990s. However, the new techniques allowed the researchers to create a viable DNA profile from one of the samples. This profile was absent from the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and did not match any known criminal or arrestee. Parabon Nanolabs used a technique known as forensic genetic genealogy. The process involved uploading the suspect's DNA profile to a publicly available genealogy database that allowed law enforcement to access it. Using family tree reconstruction and pedigree mapping, the researchers identified a cluster of people genetically related to an unknown male profile. Genetic coincidences led to the emergence of the family in southwestern Montana. After months of genealogical work and DNA triangulation, the profile was narrowed down to one person: Paul Edwin Hutchinson, born in 1969 and living in Dillon, Montana, at the time of identification. Previously, he was not listed in any criminal database. He had no arrest records and was not previously known to Gallatin County law enforcement. In early 2023, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office launched an undercover investigation into Hutchinson's biography. The observation was carried out with the aim of obtaining a direct DNA sample without public confrontation. The discarded item, which is believed to contain Hutchinson's saliva, was collected in accordance with state law. This sample was sent for comparative tests. The Montana State Forensic Laboratory has confirmed a complete DNA match between the item collected from Hutchinson and the profile developed from the evidence in the Danielle Houchins case. Based on this result, Hutchinson was classified as the prime suspect. Investigators scheduled a personal interview. On July 22, 2023, Hutchinson was contacted and voluntarily agreed to speak with law enforcement. The interview was conducted in Dillon and lasted less than 2 hours. According to official reports, Hutchinson did not admit any involvement in the crime. He denied knowing the victim or being in the Cameron Bridge area in 1996, including sweating, fidgeting, and avoiding eye contact when shown a photo of Danielle Houchins. After the interview, law enforcement began preparing a formal case to present to the Gallatin County prosecutor for possible charges. A second interview has been scheduled, and further supporting evidence is being collected. On the morning of July 23, 2023, less than 24 hours after the initial interview, the emergency dispatch office in Dillon received a 911 call from Hutchinson's home. Upon arrival, rescuers found Hutchinson dead. It was confirmed that the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Firearms were found at the scene, and no evidence of foul play by others was found. Subsequent DNA analysis of Hutchinson using a buccal swab confirmed a definitive match to a profile from the 1996 crime scene. Other suspects have not been publicly named. At the time of writing, investigators have not disclosed any known relationship or previous contact between Hutchinson and Danielle Hawkins. There is no confirmed evidence that they knew each other. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office classified the case as a closed homicide investigation after DNA confirmation. No further charges are expected in connection with the death of the suspect. Following the death of Paul Edwin Hutchinson on July 23, 2023, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office began uncovering legal and procedural steps confirming his involvement in the murder of Danielle Hawkins in 1996. A full forensic comparison was made between the DNA profile obtained from Hutchinson and the previously preserved evidence collected from the victim's body. The Montana State Forensic Laboratory has published a final report confirming a complete DNA match. The investigation team studied the history of the suspect, employment records, known addresses, and travel schemes. Hutchinson was a Montana resident at the time of the incident and lived within 100 miles of the crime scene. There was no record of him ever being questioned during the initial investigation, and his name was not mentioned in any witness statements collected during the initial investigation. No connection between Hutchinson and the victim was found in school records, phone logs, or community affiliation. According to property and employment records, Hutchinson lived in Dillon, Montana in 1996 and worked in a position related to regional travel. His trip for work could have led him to find himself near Belgrade on the specified date. However, there is no documentary evidence that he must have been in the area at the time. Investigators found no journal entries, letters, or digital messages that could clarify his motives or provide additional context for his presence near the crime scene. Following standard practice, law enforcement conducted interviews with individuals known to be close to Hutchinson in both 1996 and 2023. None of them reported any knowledge or suspicion of his involvement in the crime. He had no history of violent crime, arrests, or psychiatric institutions. Public records indicate a lack of background, and there have been no restraining orders or civil lawsuits. As soon as the forensic examination linking Hutchinson to the murder was confirmed, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in August 2023. At the briefing, they announced that the case of Danielle Hawkins had been solved with DNA evidence and that the identified suspect had died. No other persons of interest were named. The statement was the first public confirmation in more than 2 decades that law enforcement had identified the perpetrator in the case. The Sheriff's Office also recognized the contributions of outside partners in forensics, including Parabon Nanolabs, and paid tribute to advances in forensic genetic genealogy. They said that without this technology, the case would likely have gone unsolved, especially in the Belgrade and Dillon communities. News agencies across Montana and several national media outlets have published summaries of the decision in the case. Public records do not show any civil lawsuits or claims filed against Hutchinson's estate after his death. The Hawkins family issued a brief statement through law enforcement, asking for confidentiality and expressing relief that the case was de facto over. The Montana Department of Justice has officially reclassified the case as resolved by identification. No additional criminal cases were initiated. The file remains accessible to law enforcement in accordance with restricted access protocols and is not considered active. This case is now often cited as an example of how archival biological evidence, if properly preserved, can lead to successful identification decades later. It is also mentioned in the forensic literature, which discusses the role of genealogical databases, other than CODIS, in solving unsolved cases. After obtaining a confirmed match through forensic genetic testing, the Gallatin County investigation team moved to the confirmation phase, designed to strengthen the evidentiary chain linking archival biological material recovered from the victim's remains in 1996 to the male identified through genealogy analysis in 2023. While the DNA match provided scientific confirmation, the standard of investigation required additional supporting evidence to officially close the case with full institutional certainty. The identified person, whose name never surfaced either during the initial investigation or in subsequent reviews, was discovered after a long period of bioinformatic mapping and triangulation. Using publicly available genealogy data, ancestry records, and demographic statistics, the researchers created a profile based on ancestry that consistently pointed to a single male. He was confirmed to reside in southwestern Montana, and his personal history showed no previous arrests, convictions, or known ties to individuals listed in any criminal or civil Montana databases. His name did not appear in any of the original records of denunciations, testimony, or interviews conducted during the 1996 to 1998 investigation. After the official identification of the person, law enforcement agencies began a secret investigation. For weeks, officers secretly collected additional data, including historical records of vehicle ownership, driver's license renewals, previous employment, and property lease history dating back to the mid-1990s. This information has been correlated with known time and geographic markers since Danielle's disappearance. Although there were no direct records confirming his presence in Gallatin County on September 21, 1996, the subject did have working records indicating that he traveled regularly to southwestern Montana during that year. Some addresses related to his residential history were within reasonable reach of the Cameron Bridge area. Investigators examined archival data from telecommunications providers, although restrictions in document retention policies since the 1990s have limited the availability of historical information about the location of cellular stations. Despite this, circumstantial evidence indicated that the subject's occupation and access to transport could well have allowed him to be in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene undetected. Having conducted sufficient research, the investigators decided to conduct a voluntary interview not related to deprivation of liberty. The strategy was to engage the suspect in a collaborative effort to assess behavioral responses and further substantiate the results of the forensic examination. The interview was conducted in mid-2023 at the regional office in Dillon, Montana. The suspect was not under arrest and agreed to speak without a lawyer. The session lasted about 2 hours and was recorded in full, in the presence of 2 detectives. During the interrogation, the suspect denied his involvement in the case. He stated that he did not know the name Danielle Hutchins, did not remember visiting the Cameron Bridge area, and could not explain how his DNA could be related to the evidence obtained from the 15-year-old victim. Investigators reported that his behavior changed markedly when he was presented with the case file. He showed signs of physical arousal, including increased sweating, repeated face-to-face contact, and inconsistent eye contact. These remarks were recorded in the interrogation record, although none of the suspect's statements constituted a confession or legal admission of involvement. After the interrogation, law enforcement agencies carried out a court-sanctioned procedure to obtain a second DNA sample for direct comparison. A buccal blister swab was taken from the subject and sent to the Montana State Forensic Laboratory, where it was compared to the original profile obtained from the 1996 evidence. The result confirmed a complete genetic match, confirming the initial identification beyond reasonable doubt. In parallel, the investigation team sent formal information requests to educational institutions, employers, residential property managers, and utility providers to determine whether any documentation could establish a previous link between the suspect and the victim. A thorough search of school registers, medical records, and address registers was conducted. No records were found that the suspect and Danielle Hutchins visited the same facilities, lived in adjacent premises, or visited the same doctors. It was not possible to establish any known correspondence, family connection, or connection with a third party. The investigators concluded that there was no established relationship between the 2 persons. While legal documentation was in the process and formal charges were being prepared, law enforcement was in the final stages of obtaining an arrest warrant. The plan provided for the organization of armor, pretrial detention, and the initiation of a criminal case. However, before any action could be taken, events unfolded that led to an abrupt end to the trial. The morning after the interview, July 23, 2023, Dillon's emergency services received a 911 call from the suspect's home. Officers from Beaverhead County arrived at the scene and found the suspect dead. A preliminary assessment indicated a gunshot wound. A firearm registered to the deceased was found at the scene. There were no other people. A forensic medical examination concluded that the cause of death was suicide as a result of a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. No traces of foul play were found, and there was no suspicion of criminal activity at the scene other than the act itself. In accordance with the protocol, a post-mortem DNA sample was obtained and independently sent for laboratory confirmation. The test once again showed a complete match with the DNA profile extracted from the original forensic evidence. With this conclusive result, law enforcement proceeded to formally close the case. In August 2023, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office held a press briefing to announce the results. That the case of Danielle Houchins was solved through cutting-edge forensic genealogy and DNA analysis. The identified suspect died. No other persons were investigated. The case was reclassified as settled by identification, and the investigation was archived. Authorities highlighted the role of preserved biological material, meticulous documentation, and new forensic techniques in solving the case, which has been dormant for more than 25 years. They recognized the contributions of Parabon Nanolabs and the Montana State Forensic Science Laboratory, as well as the foresight of investigators in 1996, who ensured that evidence was properly stored for long-term viability. The outcome of the case was recorded in national databases of unsolved cases, including the FBI's VICAP system and the National System of Missing and Unidentified Persons, NAMUS, and the details of the decision were provided for educational purposes. No civil lawsuits or additional claims were filed against the deceased's property. The Houchins family released a brief written statement through law enforcement, expressing relief and appreciation and asking for respect for their privacy. After the identity of the person whose DNA matched the biological material found on Danielle Houchins was confirmed through laboratory analysis, Gallatin County law enforcement began officially moving the case from an unsolved case to an active prosecution. The verified coincidence allowed the case to proceed to the indictment stage, during which the law enforcement authorities, in consultation with the district attorney's office, assessed the sufficiency of the available evidence to substantiate the criminal charge. An interagency expert panel was convened to ensure that all investigative elements met the threshold required to prosecute under Montana's revised first-degree homicide laws. The Gallatin County investigation team began organizing the case file into categories of evidence, including exhibits found at the scene, forensic reports, interrogation transcripts, surveillance notes, and background checks. A verified DNA profile was listed as the main exhibit. Additional materials, such as the suspect's behavioral reactions during voluntary interrogation, were classified as corroborating documentation. Phone call metadata, vehicle registration history, and historical address records were collected through official requests to government agencies, while financial data was obtained through subpoenas issued under judicial supervision. The arrest warrant was in the final stages of preparation. Law enforcement officials confirmed that they intend to turn over the collected case materials to the Gallatin County District Attorney's Office within 1 week of receiving DNA confirmation. The goal was to bring charges under the Montana Code with comments section 45-5-102 relating to intentional homicide. The indictment plan also included possible secondary charges related to the concealment or destruction of evidence, pending further analysis of the suspect's activities after the date of the crime. The decision to postpone the public announcement of the impending arrest was strategic. Authorities chose not to disclose information until all legal documentation had been finalized, citing concerns about procedural integrity and the potential risk of escape. The suspect, Paul Edwin Hutchinson, was not under observation after the initial interrogation because he voluntarily cooperated and did not try to evade contact with investigators. At the time, he was not subject to any travel restrictions and remained at his residence in Dillon, Montana. Law enforcement officers were engaged in planning the logistics of the detention. The arrest was to be made without media involvement, with plans for immediate transportation to the Gallatin County Detention Center pending indictment. A judicial officer was temporarily appointed to preside over the first hearing. In the meantime, investigators continued to gather additional evidence to corroborate the case file, including geographical mapping of historical travel routes, vehicle inspection logs, and firearm records. However, on July 23, 2023, less than 24 hours after the initial interrogation of the suspect, a 911 call came from Hutchinson's home. Rescuers from Beaverhead County were dispatched to the scene. Upon arrival, they found Hutchinson dead from what was later confirmed to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A firearm registered to Hutchinson was found nearby. The scene was processed by district investigators and a forensic expert. No evidence of forced entry or involvement of third parties has been documented. The house was taken under guard and photographed, and an official death certificate was filed within 72 hours. In accordance with the protocol, a buccal swab was taken after the autopsy and transferred to the Montana State Forensic Laboratory. This second sample was tested against a forensic profile developed from biological evidence by Danielle Hutchins. The result confirmed a complete genetic match, providing definitive confirmation that Hutchinson was the source of the DNA discovered in 1996. Because the suspect died and the accomplices were not identified, the Gallatin County District Attorney's Office issued a notice of legal closure. In an official public statement released on August 2, 2023, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office confirmed that the homicide investigation had been completed through a forensic medical examination. The statement explains that criminal proceedings on the death of the identified suspect will not be conducted. The case was officially reclassified as resolved by identification, which is used when a prosecutor's decision becomes controversial due to the death of a person against whom the charge was being prepared. The Sheriff's Office praised the joint efforts of local law enforcement, state forensic laboratories, and private sector partners, such as Parabon Nanolabs. Officials stressed that the resolution of the case demonstrated the long-term value of preserving evidence and interagency cooperation. They also noted that this result would not have been possible without advances in forensic science, in particular the adoption of forensic genetic genealogy as a complement to traditional CODIS-based DNA matching. The decision in the Hutchins case was recorded in national databases, including the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the FBI's Violent Crime Arrest Program. He was noted in internal law enforcement bulletins as an example of successfully resolving unsolved cases without arrest. Investigative techniques were submitted for inclusion in regional training programs focused on the long-term investigation of unsolved homicides. Finally, Gallatin County Victim Services representatives made direct contact with the surviving members of the Danielle Hutchins family. They were notified of the completion of the investigation and had access to official documentation upon request. The family issued a brief public statement through law enforcement channels, acknowledging the result and expressing gratitude for the perseverance of those involved. No further public comment was forthcoming, and the family asked for confidentiality. Since then, the decision in the case has been referenced in statewide discussions about funding for unsolved cases, recommendations for preserving evidence, and law enforcement policy on non-CODIS DNA strategies. Early on a Sunday morning, October 28th, Derek made a frantic call to 911. His voice was strained as he claimed his wife was unresponsive and that he was desperately trying to perform CPR. But when the dispatcher pressed for details, what had happened, what had led to this moment, Derek's answers were vague, disjointed, and strangely lacking in specifics. Paramedics rushed to the scene within minutes, but unfortunately, there was nothing they could do. When police arrived to assess the situation, something about the scene immediately set off alarm bells. Something was not right. The atmosphere was tense, so much so that officers almost immediately called in homicide detectives. What investigators found inside the home painted a dark and chaotic picture, one that pointed not to a tragic accident, but to something far more sinister. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Kim Dorsey was born on October 10, 1974, in Jacksonville, Florida, to Dennis Dunn and Sally Ann Barrett Dunn. From the very beginning, Kim stood out, not only for her intelligence, but also for her sense of determination and quiet strength. She grew up in a loving home where achievement was encouraged, but humility was valued just as much. Friends and family recall a child with both grit and grace, someone who could recite multiplication tables with ease, but also wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty fixing a broken bicycle chain. Her classmates remember her not only as a straight A student, but as someone who offered help without being asked. She was the kind of student who volunteered to tutor peers after school, yet still made time for extracurriculars. Teachers described her as unusually mature for her age, focused and self-driven. Weekends often found the Dunn family volunteering at Dogwood Park, where Kim developed her love for animals and her community. Those volunteer days weren't just about walking dogs or cleaning up trails. They were family bonding experiences rooted in kindness and giving back. Her early success in academics and her tireless curiosity hinted at the path she would one day pursue. By the mid-1990s, Kim had her sights set on a career in engineering, an ambitious goal at a time when women were still underrepresented in the field. She enrolled at the University of North Florida, where she pursued a degree in civil engineering with an unwavering focus. Kim's university years were a blur of late-night study sessions, internships, and student leadership. She became an early and active member of the Women in Construction Club, advocating for more inclusive practices in the building trades. Her professors noted her fascination with Florida's building codes, particularly those related to hurricane resilience, a subject that resonated deeply in a state constantly under threat from nature's fury. After graduation, Kim didn't just stop at earning a diploma. She sat for Florida's rigorous state licensing exam and proudly earned her certified general contractor license, a major milestone that underscored her capability and commitment. But even that wasn't enough for someone like Kim. In her late 20s, she founded a boutique construction firm that focused on environmentally responsible and storm-resistant building practices. She quickly built a reputation for excellence and was soon appointed director of training, where she taught city inspectors how to assess structural vulnerabilities and strengthen buildings in preparation for hurricane season. Kim's professional life was full of hard hats, high-pressure deadlines, and site walkthroughs, but she managed to balance it all with a vibrant personal life. Around the year 2000, she met Derek Dorsey, a Jacksonville firefighter and paramedic. Friends and colleagues say the chemistry between them was instant, sparked by a shared love of classic muscle cars, spontaneous road trips, and a deep compassion for animals. Derek, known for his calm under pressure and dedication to public service, matched Kim's energy in all the right ways. They bonded over their mutual desire to help others, whether it was rescuing dogs or volunteering at local shelters. After dating for a couple of years, Kim and Derek married and purchased a cozy, well-kept brick home on Eastbury Drive in Jacksonville's South Side. To neighbors, the Dorseys seemed like the perfect couple. They hosted annual 4th of July barbecues, lent tools to anyone who needed them, and were always quick with a friendly wave or a helping hand. On the surface, everything seemed idyllic, a well-matched couple with rewarding careers and a strong sense of community. But behind the cheerful exterior, there were some quiet struggles. According to Derek, Kim battled periods of depression. Friends recall that she sometimes mentioned trouble sleeping and gaining weight that wouldn't budge, though she rarely let on how much it truly bothered her. She spoke about it with a wry sense of humor, making light of the symptoms even while she sought professional treatment. Despite the emotional weight, she never missed a training session, a site visit, or a charity event. Kim approached mental health with the same grit she applied to everything else, head-on and without self-pity. By October 2012, things seemed to have finally settled into a comfortable rhythm. Kim had just wrapped up the rollout of a new training program. Derek had recently switched to 24-hour shifts at the fire station, and the couple had made tentative plans to spend a quiet weekend at the beach once hurricane season had passed. Life, it seemed, was on an upswing. Then came the weekend that changed everything. On the morning of Saturday, October 27, 2012, Derek kissed Kim goodbye around 7 a.m. before heading off for a long shift. It was routine. Nothing seemed out of place. When he returned home the following morning, on Sunday, October 28th, shortly after 8 a.m., he expected to find Kim still in bed. Their bedroom had thick blackout curtains, so it was nearly pitch dark. But what he found inside that room wasn't just unexpected, it was devastating. Derek immediately called 911, reporting that his wife was unresponsive and that he was administering CPR. When asked by the dispatcher what had happened, his answer was vague and nonspecific. Emergency services arrived quickly, but it was already too late. Police officers at the scene began assessing the situation immediately, and what they saw raised red flags. The bedroom showed signs that this had not been a natural death. Homicide detectives were called in. Early estimates from the medical examiner revealed that Kim had died roughly 24 hours before the 911 call. Around the same time Derek had left for work the previous morning. The crime scene told a chaotic and chilling story. In the kitchen, more strange clues emerged. Drawers had been yanked open and their contents dumped out. remote controls, and a keypad for a surround sound system were inexplicably piled in the sink. It looked as though someone had been searching for something. Maybe valuables, or maybe something else. And while the front door showed no signs of forced entry, there was an odd detail that caught the detective's attention. A ceramic dog statue that usually stood upright by the entrance had been knocked over. It was subtle, but enough to suggest movement or a hurried exit. Police quickly came to a working theory. This wasn't a random break-in. The absence of forced entry suggested that Kim either let her attacker in willingly, or that the person had access to the house already. Given the circumstances surrounding Kim Dorsey's tragic death, it was hardly unexpected that her husband, Derek Dorsey, became the first person detectives turned to. As the last person known to have seen Kim alive, and the one who discovered her, his timeline, actions, and relationship with his wife came under immediate scrutiny. He was brought to the Jacksonville Police Department for formal questioning shortly after the initial investigation began. Detectives approached the interview methodically, aiming to understand Derek's movements and behavior over the course of the weekend in question. He was calm, cooperative, and appeared open to sharing information. When asked to recount the days leading up to the incident, Derek provided a seemingly straightforward account. On Friday, Kim had left the house for a few hours to run errands, which included a shopping trip. That evening, they stayed in, ordered food, and watched a movie together. A quiet, uneventful night by his description. Derek explained that he had to work a 24-hour shift beginning early Saturday morning. He left the house around 7 a.m. and drove to his assigned fire station, located on the northern outskirts of the county. The station was approximately 15 miles from their home, and while not remote, the area was known for spotty mobile phone reception. He claimed to have tried contacting Kim several times throughout the day, but his calls either failed to go through or were dropped mid-connection. He wrapped up his shift by 8 a.m. Sunday and drove straight home, only to discover what he described as a devastating and surreal scene. At first glance, Derek's account appeared to match the basic facts available to detectives. His story aligned with his work schedule, and initial timelines didn't present any glaring inconsistencies. However, there was one detail that detectives found puzzling. Derek, a seasoned emergency responder with years of field experience, had spoken in a disoriented and almost incoherent manner during the 911 call. It struck investigators as odd that someone so trained in crisis situations would react in such a scattered way. This discrepancy raised questions. Was it emotional distress? Was he hiding something? Or was he possibly involved in some way? As the interview progressed, detectives steered the conversation toward his marriage. Derek described his relationship with Kim as unconventional but consensual. According to him, they had agreed years earlier to maintain a form of open relationship, allowing both partners to explore connections outside of their marriage. However, he said Kim had stepped away from that lifestyle after suffering the loss of her mother, which occurred roughly 3 to 4 years prior. He explained that Kim had taken the loss very hard, which led her to seek mental health support. As part of her treatment, she began taking prescribed medication that, while effective, came with side effects, including weight gain. Derek noted that these changes may have affected how Kim saw herself, though she continued to function in her career and daily life with characteristic discipline. While Kim had reportedly ended her involvement with others, detectives needed to know whether Derek had done the same. In many investigations, strained relationships or romantic entanglements become crucial threads. Derek admitted he was currently seeing another woman. This raised natural questions. Had he fallen in love with someone else? Did he want out of the marriage? Was there any potential financial motive? When detectives asked if Kim had a life insurance policy, Derek replied that she did not. That removed one possible incentive, but the inquiry didn't end there. Detectives evaluated Derek's alibi more closely. The travel time from his fire station to the house was roughly 30 minutes each way, meaning a round trip would take close to an hour. They questioned his fellow firefighters, all of whom confirmed that Derek had been present at the station throughout the entirety of his shift. The firehouse was small, the kind where comings and goings are hard to miss. Their accounts matched his own, confirming that Derek had what investigators often refer to as an airtight alibi. This discovery forced detectives to broaden their focus. Still, suspicion lingered. Love triangles, jealousy, and broken promises have long played a role in domestic tragedies. Investigators considered whether Derek's girlfriend might have had a motive, perhaps fueled by resentment or an unfulfilled promise of divorce. But after a thorough interview and review of her whereabouts, she too was cleared of suspicion. She had a solid alibi for the time frame in question. With both Derek and his girlfriend effectively ruled out, detectives returned to the Dorsey residence for a fresh examination of the crime scene. Sometimes, a second pass can reveal things that were overlooked in the initial wave of activity. This time, they brought in behavioral analysts and forensic experts to help reconstruct the sequence of events. These specialists offered new perspectives. Their task was to determine the point of origin, the moment the confrontation began. According to their findings, the altercation likely started upstairs, where a pool sticks normally kept in a storage rack had been taken and used. The knife, later recovered from the kitchen, was part of a match set located in a drawer that wasn't in plain view. These details strongly suggested that the perpetrator wasn't a stranger. This was someone familiar with the home's layout, someone who either lived there at some point or spent enough time in the house to know where things were stored. That alone shifted the direction of the investigation. If the person responsible had intimate knowledge of the home, then it was highly likely that they had a personal connection to the Dorsey family. More tellingly, investigators had already recovered a DNA sample from the scene that they believed belonged to the assailant. Now they needed to match that sample against known individuals who had been inside the home. Detectives pressed Derek for names. Who had stayed in their home before? Who had access to the property when he wasn't there? It turned out that Derek, aside from being a firefighter, also worked as a general contractor and often employed day laborers and subcontractors. Some of these workers, particularly during hard times, had even stayed at the Dorsey residence temporarily. As detectives dug deeper into the growing web of people who had once passed through the Dorsey household, one name repeatedly resurfaced: Lance Kirkpatrick. Derek Dorsey reported that Lance was someone he had once worked with on various contracting jobs. Over time, the two developed what Derek described as a casual friendship, born more out of shared labor than personal closeness. But when Lance hit a rough patch, Derek did what he had done for others in the past. He extended a helping hand. Wanting to offer stability to someone struggling, Derek allowed Lance to live in his home for several months. At first, things were amicable. Lance was quiet, respectful, and helped out with small repairs and errands. But that arrangement began to deteriorate when Lance reportedly started drinking more heavily. According to Derek, the shift in Lance's behavior became noticeable. He was no longer the subdued houseguest, but someone who brought tension into the home. Eventually, things reached a point where Derek had to ask him to leave. Derek claimed the decision wasn't made lightly, but Kim had grown increasingly uncomfortable, and their peaceful home life had begun to fray. When investigators asked where Lance had been the weekend, Derek said that, as far as he knew, Lance had been out on a boat in the Atlantic Ocean, far from Jacksonville, and presumably with no access to a vehicle or way to return. This alibi, while difficult to verify immediately, gave detectives pause. It was vague and lacked a concrete location or witness confirmation. Still, without solid evidence placing him at the crime scene, they had to keep moving. The second individual Derek mentioned was someone named Joshua V., another man he had taken under his wing during his side work as a general contractor. Much like with Lance, Derek offered Joshua both employment and temporary housing. Joshua lived in their home for a time, though the arrangement eventually fell apart due to disagreements, likely personality clashes or differing expectations. While Joshua moved out, Derek continued to offer him occasional work doing small jobs or manual labor. According to Derek, he had plans to meet Joshua on the morning of Kim's death. In fact, Derek explained that after wrapping up his 24-hour shift at the fire station on Sunday morning, he was supposed to meet Joshua at a local convenience store. They had arranged to connect there so Joshua could join him on a new work project. But Joshua never showed up. That detail raised a red flag for investigators. If Joshua was eager for employment and needed the income, why would he fail to appear at a scheduled meeting with someone offering him a job? Now, under heightened suspicion, Joshua V. was located and brought in for questioning. During the interview, detectives pressed him about his whereabouts over the weekend. Joshua claimed he had spent the entire time partying at his home with friends, adding that he hadn't left his house during the hours the crime occurred. The detectives then shifted gears and asked whether he had ever been romantically involved with Kim Dorsey. Joshua denied any such relationship. His answers were relatively straightforward, until detectives reported that Kim had died. At that moment, Joshua's demeanor changed dramatically. He began crying, visibly upset, seemingly overwhelmed. But the detectives were experienced and cautious. Emotional outbursts, especially when a suspect is told of a death, can be either authentic or performative. Was this guilt, shock, or an attempt to appear sympathetic? Regardless, protocol required a DNA sample, which Joshua provided voluntarily. When the forensic analysis came back, it conclusively showed that Joshua Vay's DNA did not match the sample recovered from the scene. That eliminated him as a suspect and brought the police no closer to solving Kim Dorsey's murder. Determined not to overlook any possibility, detectives returned to Derek Dorsey and requested a full list of every person who had stayed at or spent significant time in the Dorsey household in recent years. This process was extensive. Names were cross-checked, interviews were conducted, and DNA samples were collected and tested. One by one, all were ruled out. Either their alibis were verified, or their DNA failed to match the forensic evidence. Still searching for clarity, the investigative team decided to revisit the crime scene with Derek himself in tow. Walking through the house with someone who knows its layout can yield subtle but critical insights. As they moved through the kitchen, Derek pointed out the strangest part of the scene. 4 remote controls, part of the home's surround sound system, had been tossed into the sink. The remotes had been soaked, likely damaged beyond repair. To seasoned detectives, this was not a random act. It looked calculated. Whoever did this may have been trying to erase fingerprints or DNA, thinking the water might destroy forensic evidence. That level of precaution hinted that the intruder was familiar not just with the house, but with what could be used against them in an investigation. Even more intriguing, when Derek turned on the TV during the walkthrough, a movie began playing, a title he swore he had never watched. This sparked a chilling possibility. Had the person responsible lingered in the house after committing the crime? Could they have calmly watched a movie in the living room, perhaps to regroup or wait for the right moment to leave? That recollection triggered another memory in Derek's mind. On Friday afternoon, just about 12 hours before Kim's estimated time of death, a technician had visited the home to fix ongoing issues with their entertainment system. There had been problems with the remote controls, and Derek had called the company to schedule a service call. The technician came, completed the repairs, and left. But could he have returned? Investigators quickly tracked down the technician. During the interview, they noticed that he had visible cuts on his hands. When asked, he said the injuries were work-related, typical for someone dealing with wires, tools, and sharp corners on a daily basis. He denied any involvement in the crime and was cooperative with the process, even agreeing to a DNA swab. When results came back, his DNA did not match what had been found at the Dorsey home. The case seemed to stall, until a routine police database search turned up a highly relevant report, a vehicle-related complaint classified as temporary authorized use. That's legal terminology for a very specific situation, where someone is given permission to use a car, but then fails to return it as agreed. The report had been filed just 17 hours before Kim's death. The complainant? A young woman. The person she had let borrow her vehicle? Lance Kirkpatrick. Lance had told Derek he would be out on a boat that weekend, but the police report painted a very different picture. The woman who filed the complaint said that she, Lance, and a few others were at a party on Friday night. Sometime during the evening, Lance offered to go out and get drinks. She allowed him to use her car, a decision she would soon regret, because he never came back. This bombshell reopened the case in a whole new light. Lance's ocean alibi now looked increasingly unreliable. Detectives shifted focus. The next logical question: did that car, the one Lance was last seen driving, ever travel near Kim Dorsey's home? When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, their responsibilities extended far beyond securing the area and collecting physical evidence. One of the most vital components of any investigation, especially one involving a potential homicide, is speaking with those who might have seen or heard something suspicious. So, As part of their early procedural steps, the patrol officers began canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, spoke to residents, and asked a range of questions. Had anyone seen an unfamiliar car? A stranger walking around? Any sounds or disruptions? One neighbor, living just a few houses down from the Dorseys, told an officer that he had noticed a small blue SUV parked outside the Dorsey home on the morning of the incident. The vehicle had caught his attention, not because of any overtly alarming behavior, but simply because it wasn't one of the usual cars seen on that quiet suburban street. The description matched the exact make and color of the vehicle Lance Kirkpatrick had been seen driving, and which, according to a recent report, had been taken without being returned from a party the night before. A few days later, investigators received a critical tip that dramatically narrowed their focus. Surveillance footage had been recovered from a home security system just down the street from the Dorsey residence. The timestamp on the footage was chilling. At approximately 6:30 a.m., on the day Kim Dorsey lost her life, the small blue SUV was clearly visible, parked directly in front of her house. The car remained there for a short while before vanishing from the frame. This visual evidence was the missing puzzle piece. Once confirmed, Lance Kirkpatrick was no longer just a person of interest. He became the primary suspect. To locate him, detectives reached back out to the woman who had originally loaned the vehicle to Lance at the Friday night party. She explained that after Lance left with the vehicle, she hadn't seen him again and had no idea where he might be. However, she did provide another valuable lead, a friend of Lance's named Brian Kafir. She believed Brian might know where Lance had gone after the party. Investigators wasted no time. Brian was picked up for questioning and brought to the precinct for a formal interview. At first, Brian appeared cooperative. He explained that he had also been at the same party where the SUV had disappeared. When asked about his involvement, Brian was quick to clarify that he wasn't the one who had driven off with the vehicle, but he was concerned when Lance disappeared. In fact, he said he'd spent most of the night riding around in a taxi trying to track Lance down. He said he hadn't been successful until the following day. When he finally found Lance, he said he looked worn out, disheveled. He had a noticeable wound on one of his arms. But it wasn't just Lance's physical state that disturbed Brian. It was what he said next. According to Brian, Lance confessed in vague but deeply disturbing terms. He reportedly told Brian something along the lines of, "I'm going to jail." He didn't elaborate much at first, but then began to mention things only someone directly involved would know. Details that hadn't yet been released publicly and would have been impossible for someone on the outside to fabricate. His tone was flat, not dramatic. This wasn't a boast. It was more like a resigned acknowledgement. Brian said that while he was stunned by what he was hearing, he didn't know what to do in the moment. He hadn't initially gone to the police, unsure of what was true, and what might have been alcohol-fueled exaggeration. Detectives knew that confessions can come from many places. Sometimes guilt overpowers a person's need for secrecy. Other times, substances such as alcohol loosen tongues. But Brian's account was serious enough to warrant immediate action. At this point, there were two possibilities. Either Lance Kirkpatrick was the perpetrator, or Brian Kafir knew more than he was admitting, possibly implicating himself. But then Brian provided something unexpected. He told detectives that Lance was hiding in the attic of his house. That single admission changed everything. Officers moved quickly. A team was dispatched to Brian's home. There, hiding in a cramped, dusty attic space, they found Lance Kirkpatrick. He didn't resist arrest. In fact, he seemed eerily calm, as if he had already accepted that his freedom was over. Back at the station, Lance was placed in an interview room and questioned about his relationship with the Dorsey family. He admitted that he had known Derek Dorsey for quite some time. They had worked together in construction, and he had even lived at the Dorsey home for a period during a difficult chapter in his life. That arrangement gave him insight into the family's habits, including the layout of the home and Derek's rotating firefighter schedule. Lance confirmed he knew Derek would not be home that Saturday. He would be on a 24-hour shift. That meant Kim would be home alone. When asked directly about his relationship with Kim, Lance maintained that there were never any problems between them. But before investigators could dig deeper, Lance requested an attorney. The interview came to an abrupt halt. With no verbal confession and no cooperation, detectives were forced to rely entirely on forensic evidence. This is where technology and science stepped in. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Lance's father and compared it to the DNA collected at the crime scene. The results were definitive. The familial DNA match left no room for doubt. Lance Kirkpatrick's genetic profile matched the biological material recovered from Kim Dorsey's home. This not only confirmed his presence at the scene, but it also definitively ruled out Brian Kefir, whose name could now be cleared. Piecing together everything they had learned, detectives believed Lance had been strategic and premeditated in his actions. The timeline was damning. After leaving the party on Friday night with the borrowed vehicle, he disappeared until the following day. Surveillance showed him near Kim Dorsey's home early that morning. He knew where the spare key was hidden, beneath a decorative ceramic dog statue by the front entrance. He knew the Dorseys well enough to anticipate their routines. He let himself in quietly, but it's believed Kim heard or sensed his presence. What followed inside the house remains partially unknown, locked behind silence. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Lance Kirkpatrick initially pleaded not guilty. He refused to admit responsibility in the early stages of the legal process. But nearly 2 years after Kim's death, as the case approached trial, he reversed course. Lance ultimately admitted to causing Kim's death but claimed it had not been intentional. His version of events portrayed the incident as a tragic accident that unfolded in a heated moment. He insisted he had not come to harm Kim and that things had escalated in ways he hadn't foreseen. During trial proceedings, Lance painted a picture of himself as a close friend of the Dorseys. He said that Kim had even helped train him in fitness. They reportedly went to the gym together multiple times a week and occasionally had drinks afterward. He described their relationship as friendly, casual, and based on mutual support. However, under cross-examination, these comments only raised more questions than answers. Notably, he admitted that the DVD found playing in the Dorsey home's entertainment system belonged to him. That piece of evidence, initially baffling, now made sense. Investigators believed he had stayed inside the house after the crime, possibly watching the film, possibly trying to decide what to do next. As for why he didn't call 911, Lance claimed he panicked. He said he was overwhelmed, frightened, and unsure of what to do. Instead of seeking help, he fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would eventually bring him to justice. "I was frantic. I didn't know what to do. I was scared," Kirkpatrick told the court, his voice low and unsteady. "I just sat and was waiting for the police." His words, while simple, were delivered with a visible mix of anxiety and weariness. To some, he sounded remorseful, to others, evasive. The courtroom, already heavy with emotion, grew quieter still. But it was the cross-examination that truly tested Kirkpatrick's account. The prosecuting attorney, determined to hold him accountable in the eyes of the jury, began pressing him hard. Piece by piece, the state sought to highlight contradictions in Kirkpatrick's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies between what he had told detectives and what he was now telling the court. At times, Kirkpatrick appeared confused, at others, defensive. His responses lacked clarity, and as the prosecution weaved through the facts of the case, his stolen vehicle access, his prior knowledge of Derek Dorsey's schedule, the hidden key, the damaged remotes, and the DVD he admitted was his, it became harder for the jury to ignore the growing list of unsettling truths. Then came the final piercing question: what punishment do you think you deserve for what happened to Kim Dorsey? For a long moment, there was silence. All eyes turned toward the witness stand. Kirkpatrick, now visibly affected, looked down before responding. "I'm guilty," he said softly, voice cracking. "I don't know what I want right now." His answer was both an admission and a deflection. While acknowledging his guilt, he still avoided stating what he believed justice should look like. It was a moment that encapsulated much of the trial. Layers of emotional ambiguity, personal failure, and irreversible loss. Following days of deliberations and testimony, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation in May 2015. Though the prosecution had pursued the death penalty, the jury ultimately opted for mercy over capital punishment. They recommended 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge accepted their recommendation, and Lance Kirkpatrick was officially sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Following the sentencing, Kim's husband, Derek Dorsey, stood to speak, his expression strained and tearful. "Kim Dorsey was so much more than a firefighter's wife," he said. "She was my partner, my best friend, and the strongest person I've ever known." June 13, 1993, began as a normal summer Sunday in Minneapolis. Residents went about their business, unaware that the silence of one apartment building would soon be broken by a horrific discovery. There was an eerie silence in apartment 202 on Pleasant Avenue, too long and unnatural. That all changed around noon, when a maintenance worker, responding to complaints about water leaking into the apartment downstairs, walked up to Jeanie Childs' door. The shower in her bathroom had been working for several hours. At first, he just knocked, but there was no answer. He then used his lockpick and went inside. What he saw exceeded his worst expectations. The djinn's body lay on the floor, surrounded by the traces of a fierce struggle. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the furniture, even on the ceiling. Every detail spoke of the killer's rage and the victim's desperate resistance. And the water from the shower continued to pour, mixing with the bloody puddles on the floor. Terrified, the worker recoiled, ran out of the apartment, and immediately called the police. This was just the beginning of one of the most mysterious cases in the history of Minneapolis. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Jeanie Ann Childs was born in 1958 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, into a modest working-class family. From the beginning, her life was defined by the social and economic realities of the Midwest. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Minneapolis was a city in transition, where prosperity in some sectors was balanced by persistent inequality in others. Jeanie grew up in a loving family, but they also had their own problems. Her parents worked long hours to provide for the family, and as one of several siblings, Jeanie learned the values of resilience and survival early on. As a child, Jeanie was described as outgoing, inquisitive, and energetic. She loved music, and could often be found dancing in the living room or singing with her sisters. Despite financial difficulties, the Childs family maintained strong ties with the community, meeting frequently at dinner parties, at church, and at neighbors' homes. As a child, Jeanie was an energetic and outgoing child, but as she got older, she became more quiet and reserved. This is not surprising in a situation where economic hardship is limiting educational support and opportunities. By the late 1970s, Jeanie found herself face-to-face with adulthood, without the benefits that many others took for granted. Her parents did not provide her with money, and could not provide her with the same lifestyle as her peers. Therefore, she worked in various low-paid jobs, cleaner in offices, waitress, and sometimes engaged in administrative work. But it was difficult to hold on to a steady job, especially when economic downturns hit local industry. Like many women in her situation, Jeanie began to struggle with housing instability, financial instability, and eventually illicit substance abuse. It was during this time that she turned to sex work, not as a planned career, but as a means of survival in a system that offered few alternatives. It's important to understand the reasons why Jeanie made this choice. This industry in Minneapolis, like in many American cities, flourished in areas where marginalized women often struggle with addiction or poverty. Apartment buildings were in a dilapidated state, maintenance was carried out irregularly, and there was often no security. The apartment in which Jeanie lived reflected these conditions. A small, simple room in a building with high staff turnover and little supervision. And yet, despite these difficult circumstances, Jeanie managed to create a semblance of a home. She embellished her space with small, personal touches, photographs, inexpensive knickknacks, secondhand furniture, creating an environment that, though modest, gave her a sense of ownership and control. Neighbors remembered her as friendly and approachable, often willing to share a cigarette or chat in the hallway. She was known to keep an eye on young women in the building, giving them advice or warning them of dangerous clients. Despite the dangers associated with her work, Jeanie kept in touch with her family. She called her sister regularly, dropping by family gatherings from time to time whenever she could. Friends recalled that she often talked about her desire to change her life, to quit a harmful addiction, leave the street and find a stable job. But dependency, poverty, and systematic neglect have made these dreams incredibly difficult to realize. There wasn't an easy path to recovery or reintegration, especially for the women in her situation. So Jeanie continued to lead the one life she knew, struggling to make ends meet, taking care of herself as best she could. Her personal struggles reflected a broader social dynamic. In the early 1990s, the United States was in the midst of a so-called war on illicit substances, which was characterized by aggressive police control of street crime. But little attention was paid to the underlying social problems that lead to drug use and poverty. Women like Jeanie were often criminalized, stigmatized, and left without a meaningful support system. At that time, Jeanie was 35 years old. She was a very strong but deeply vulnerable woman. It is important to remember that it was determined not only by its difficulties. She was, as her sister later described it, a person with a big heart, someone who always wanted the best, someone who cared about others even when she was struggling. Jeanie's life paints a complex picture of survival and vulnerability. She was a nobody. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She laughed and loved. She dreamed and hoped, and she carried with her the scars of a life spent in a merciless world. When Jeanie Childs first came to light in the media, it largely boiled down to a set of stereotypes about a poor life. But for those who knew her, these labels did not reflect the whole reality. She was a woman with choices, albeit limited by circumstances. Yes, she made a choice, but in conditions where the choice was limited, and the risks were always present. June 13, 1993 began, like many summer Sundays in Minneapolis, restless. The neighbors were busy with their morning chores, but there was only silence outside the door of apartment 202 in the red brick house on Pleasant Avenue. That silence was broken around noon when a maintenance worker, responding to complaints about water seeping through the ceiling into the apartment below, approached Jeanie Childs' apartment. The shower in her bathroom had been working for several hours. Alarmed, but not yet alarmed, the worker knocked on the door several times. When no one answered, he used his keys to unlock the apartment. What he found inside was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Jeanie's body lay on the floor, surrounded by a scene of shocking violence. Blood covered every object in the apartment, testifying to both the victim's desperate attempts to escape and the killer's movements in space. The shower was still running, mixing with the blood that had seeped into the bathroom tiles and accumulated on the baseboards. The repairman recoiled in horror and immediately called the police. Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department arrived within minutes, cordoned off the scene, and began what has become one of the city's most famous homicide investigations. For the investigators who entered the apartment, the crime scene was unforgettable. Experienced detectives, some of whom have years of experience, later described it as one of the most violent and horrific scenes they had ever encountered. Jeanie suffered dozens of stab wounds. More than 65 were later counted, indicating not only the intent to kill, but also the level of rage that a personal motive suggested. Investigators quickly identified the victim as 35-year-old Jeanie Ann Childs, a well-known resident of the building. Police interviewed neighbors, some of whom said they had heard the sounds of a struggle the night before, although none of them had called police at the time. Others mentioned seeing strange men coming and going from Jeanie's apartment in the days leading up to her death. But the descriptions were vague, and there were no obvious suspects. The apartment itself was a mess, not only because of the violence, but also because of Jeanie's lifestyle. Traces of use, personal belongings scattered on surfaces, as well as evidence of recent sexual activity were found. Police collected physical evidence, including fingerprints, blood samples, and items containing what they believe is the suspect's DNA. However, despite the abundance of forensic materials, technology was limited at the time. In 1993, DNA testing was still in its early stages, and there was no way to match unknown samples to a national database. Investigators collected evidence, took notes, and hoped that traditional detective work, interviews, informants, street evidence, would lead them to the killer. But as the days turned into weeks, no reliable leads emerged. Jeanie's lifestyle complicated the investigation. Adult workers were often victims of violence, and their cases rarely attracted public attention. Potential witnesses did not dare to testify, fearing retribution or exposure. Moreover, the Minneapolis Police Department struggled with high crime rates and limited resources, forcing investigators to juggle multiple cases at once. However, the murder of the Jeanie haunted the detectives assigned to investigate him. What set him apart was the sheer brutality of the attack. This was not a failed robbery or an accidental act of violence. It was a deliberate, insane murder. Investigators believe the killer spent some time in the apartment after the murder, moving, possibly grooming himself, leaving traces that could blend in with those of the dying victim. If you left the shower on, it was either panic or a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. In any case, the crime scene was full of evidence, but without the right tools to handle it, the case came to a standstill. For the Jeanie family, the wait was excruciating. They continued to live their lives, knowing that her killer was still at large, that justice had not been served, and that over time the outcome had become even more unlikely. As anniversaries passed, they cherished memories, photos, letters, shared moments, and tried to keep her name alive even as the world moved on. However, as forensic science continued to evolve, so did the techniques that investigators used to find long-dormant leads. Units for investigating unsolved cases have appeared, focused specifically on re-examining old evidence with the help of new tools. And in Minneapolis, the murder of Jeanie Childs remained on the list of cases awaiting retrial. The discovery of Jeanie's body in June 1993 marked the beginning of a years-long search for answers. A search that would eventually cross state lines using cutting-edge technology and challenge the limits of what law enforcement could achieve, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable violence and a forever changed family. During the investigation, investigative genealogy was used. This approach, virtually unknown to the public just a few years ago, has now become a watershed moment in solving unsolved cases, bringing hope to situations that have long seemed intractable. Investigative genealogy works by identifying partial genetic matches between DNA from crime scenes and people who have submitted their DNA to public databases. These matches can be distant relatives or even more distant relatives. But with careful analysis, genealogists can build a family tree that narrows the field of potential suspects. Working with private forensics firms specializing in genetic genealogy, investigators sent a DNA profile to GEDmatch in search of partial matches. The process was painstaking and time-consuming. Genealogists studied potential relatives, studied public records, traced family lines, and gradually built a network of connections. Through this painstaking work, they were able to narrow down their focus to a few people whose genetic profiles indicated a close connection to an unknown suspect. And now, in 2019, nearly 26 years later, the world finally knows the identity of Jeanie Childs' killer. Jerry Lynn Westerm, a businessman, husband, and father from Minnesota, who has lived in the public eye for decades. Arrested, accused, convicted. One name quickly rose to the top: Jerry Westerm. Westerm had never had a criminal record before, and his DNA was not in any criminal databases. Without the use of genetic genealogy, investigators would not have been able to identify him. But genealogical analysis helped a lot. Investigators placed him in the center of a family tree built on DNA matches, making him the most likely candidate. At this point, however, investigators needed a corroborating sample that would definitively link Westerm's DNA to evidence from the crime scene. This led to one of the highlights of the investigation. Surveillance teams followed Westerm in public, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. At a hockey game in Minneapolis, they saw him eating a hot dog, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and throwing the napkin in the trash. This seemingly mundane act gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. The tissue was extracted, tested, and found to match the DNA profile from Jeanie Childs' apartment. The use of discarded items to collect DNA is a legally complex area, but has been upheld in U.S. courts. Once a person disposes of an item in a public place, they are effectively waiving any reasonable expectation of confidentiality regarding the biological material they have left behind. This legal principle allowed investigators to obtain Westerm's DNA without his knowledge or consent, ensuring that the investigation could continue without his warning. Once the match was confirmed, law enforcement acted quickly. The evidence was compelling, and the risk of evidence slipping away or being destroyed is high. In February 2019, police arrested Westerm at his home, issued a search warrant for his property, and began preparing the case for prosecution. The arrest made national headlines both because of the brutality of the crime and the advanced forensic techniques used to solve it. In the case of Children of the Jeanie, the use of genetic genealogy has yielded answers that have eluded researchers for more than 2 decades. This connected the dots between the unknown DNA profile and the suspect, who had managed to evade detection for years. And it was a kind of completion for a family that had waited too long for justice. For the Jeanie family, the revelation of the killer's identity was both shocking and bittersweet. They were stunned to learn that the person responsible for this had lived so openly, so normally, for so many years. They were grateful to the investigators and scientists who worked tirelessly to see the case through. But they were also reminded of all the lost time, birthdays, anniversaries, moments of mourning that dragged on unanswered. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the importance of perseverance and innovation. Investigators who worked on the case in the 1990s were acquitted, knowing that the evidence they had carefully stored would eventually be used to bring justice to justice. Young detectives newly assigned to the Unsolved Cases Unit saw in the Childs case a model of what can be achieved when science and determination come together. In the courtroom, DNA evidence became the cornerstone of the prosecution. It wasn't the only evidence. There were also footprints, historical records, and patterns of behavior. But genetic coincidence was the element that tied it all together. He turned a number of suspicions into a formal indictment, setting the stage for a subsequent trial. As the trial approached, the community was closely following what was happening. Many have been fascinated by science, intrigued by the idea that a tiny piece of genetic material could stretch over decades to identify a killer. Others were more focused on the human dimension, reflecting on the lives of Jeanie's children and the long struggles her family endured. Together, these threads weaved together a deeply modern and deeply human narrative, a story of violence, loss, and ultimately, the search for justice. Jerry Westerm's arrest in February 2019 didn't end the story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter that will test the strength of the evidence, the reach of the legal system, and the resilience of a family and community that has waited nearly 26 years to be held accountable. For the Jeanie Childs family, Westerm's arrest was a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. On the one hand, they were grateful that after decades of silence, someone had been identified and blamed. On the other hand, they were painfully aware that no legal outcome could restore what had been lost. Jeanie was gone, her life was brutally taken, and nothing that happened in court could bring her back. For them, justice was not about restoration, but about recognition, responsibility, and confidence that the person who killed her would not go unpunished. The trial began almost immediately after Westrom's arrest. The Hennepin County District Attorney's Office filed first- and second-degree murder charges, alleging that Westerm entered Jeanie's apartment on the night of June 13, 1993, and brutally stabbed her to death. They disputed that the DNA evidence left no room for doubt. Westrom's genetic material was found not only on a blanket and objects next to the victim's body, but also mixed with Jeanie's own DNA, indicating direct physical involvement in the crime. From the beginning, Westerm insisted on his innocence. His defense, consisting of experienced criminal defense attorneys, quickly prepared a counterargument. They argued that the presence of his DNA at the crime scene did not prove murder. They speculated that Westerm may have had previous contact with Jeanie unrelated to the night of her death. They drew attention to the lack of direct witness testimony, the lack of physical evidence to identify him at the scene of the crime at the time of the crime, as well as the passage of time, which, in their view, undermined the credibility of other evidence. The prosecution, however, believed that they had irrefutable evidence. In addition to the DNA match, they pointed to bloody footprints found at the crime scene, which forensic examinations showed matched the size and pattern of Westrom's legs. They also drew attention to Westrom's story. Although he had no convictions for violent crimes, investigators found a pattern of behavior that they believed fit the profile of a person capable of extreme violence in certain circumstances. The preparation for the trial was long and difficult. Both parties were involved in extensive pre-trial motions, discussing what evidence would be admissible, what expert testimony would be allowed, and how jurors would be instructed to interpret scientific evidence. These legal maneuvers were decisive because the case relied heavily on forensic evidence. The reliability of the family tree, the interpretation of DNA matches, and the broader question of what constitutes, beyond reasonable doubt, evidence in a case that modern science decides. For decades after the brutal murder of Jeanie Childs in her Minneapolis apartment, the case remained in limbo, remaining a painful and unsolved chapter in the city's criminal history. Investigators working at the crime scene in June 1993 knew they were dealing with a crime of extraordinary brutality. Jeanie had been stabbed more than 60 times. Her apartment had been left in a state of chaos. Her body was only discovered after a worker reacted to a water leak the next day. Despite collecting biological evidence at the time, the tools available in the 1990s did not offer a clear path to identifying her killer. Years passed, and the case turned into a closed one. From time to time, new detectives were appointed to check this. The evidence was periodically checked and reviewed. But the evidence dried up. Witnesses passed or passed away, and the collective memory of the crime faded. For the Jeanie family, each past year has brought new grief and disappointment. A sense that justice may never come, that her name will remain associated not with a clue, but with a painful mystery. By the end of the 2010s, this approach was gaining popularity. High-profile cases that were once considered unsolvable have begun to unravel, sometimes at astonishing speed. Investigators have begun to go back to the decade-old files, sifting through evidence that has been lying in vaults for years, in the hope that science can now provide a breakthrough that cannot be achieved by human search alone. The case of Jeanie Childs, carefully preserved in the evidence archives, was one such case. Biological material collected at the crime scene in 1993 was preserved, and it was still suitable for extended DNA analysis. Detectives working in partnership with genetic genealogists sent a sample to a public genealogy platform in search of any distant family ties that might arise. The process was painstaking and complex. Genealogists traced family trees, compared genetic markers, examined public records, and narrowed down potential people who might be associated with an unknown DNA profile. Investigators worked meticulously, keeping legal and ethical issues in mind, and were prepared to proceed with caution once they identified a potential suspect. But even as these scientific breakthroughs unfolded, the Jeanie family didn't know the details. For them, this case remained persecution, a crime that deprived them of a sister, a daughter, and a friend. A wound that never healed. Each year brought another anniversary, another reflection on the life she could have lived, another reminder of the questions that had gone unanswered for too long. At the same time, legal teams were preparing for what could be a landmark case, anticipating legal battles over the admissibility of genetic genealogy, the integrity of evidence collected decades ago, and broader ethical debates about privacy, consent, and the role of science in criminal justice. Both the prosecution and the defense have been preparing legal strategies, quietly preparing for a confrontation that could redefine what it means to solve an unsolved case in the 19th century. The public remained in the dark about the momentous event. Reporters occasionally returned to Jeanie's story in special reports or anniversary articles, but there were no dramatic headlines, no public evidence, and there was no sense that a decision was just around the corner. Even in police circles, only a small group of investigators knew that the breakthrough they had long hoped for could soon become a reality. This was followed by a methodical process of confirming the evidence. Investigators conducted covert surveillance, waited for an opportunity to collect a legally acceptable DNA sample, and painstakingly double-checked their findings. In the background, forensic experts prepared detailed reports, prosecutors wrote legal memoranda, and court staff worked quietly to ensure that every step met the standards of justice. All of this work has led to one defining moment, the culmination of years of disillusionment with research and technological innovation. For the Jeanie family, for the city of Minneapolis, and for law enforcement and forensic experts in general, this was a fateful moment. It was not only the long-awaited exposure of the killer, but also proof that even after decades of silence, justice can still find its voice. Prosecutors, led by experienced murder lawyers, stubbornly resisted. They noted that the U.S. legal system has long considered items discarded in public places, including trash, to be legitimate loot for collection and analysis. They noted that genetic genealogy is increasingly being accepted in courts across the country, including in the high-profile conviction of a Golden State Killer in California. Importantly, they stressed that the definitive DNA match was not obtained by genealogical inference, but by direct laboratory comparison of DNA from the crime scene and biological material from Westerm. The preliminary hearings were exhaustive. Expert witnesses were called to explain the principles of genetic genealogy, the chain of evidence, and the protocols that had to be followed to ensure the integrity of the forensic process. The judges reviewed judicial precedents, weighed constitutional concerns, and ultimately ruled that the evidence was admissible. These decisions paved the way for a full-fledged jury trial. The selection of the jury was not easy. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the intense media coverage of the use of genetic genealogy, both the defense and the prosecution worked diligently to identify jurors who could approach the evidence impartially. Potential jurors were asked about their familiarity with DNA evidence, their views on privacy, and their understanding of reasonable doubt. After a thorough check, the jury sat down, and the trial officially began. The accusation began with a simple but powerful narrative. In June 1993, Jerry Westerm brutally murdered Jeanie Childs in her apartment, leaving behind a chaotic, bloody crime scene. The evidence collected at the time, including biological material, was preserved and eventually matched to Westerm using advanced forensic techniques. The DNA match was presented as the linchpin of the case, supported by corroborating physical evidence, expert testimony, and a chronology of actions. The defense, meanwhile, tried to establish reasonable doubts. They acknowledged that Westerm's DNA was present, but argued that this did not necessarily indicate that he was at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. They put forward alternative theories. Perhaps Westerm made love by mutual consent to Jeanie before her death. Perhaps the DNA evidence has been distorted or misinterpreted. Perhaps the focus on forensic evidence blinded investigators to other, more likely suspects. Witnesses included forensic experts, law enforcement officers who worked on the case in the 1990s and 2000s, genetic genealogists, and members of the Jeanie family. Each of them was a piece of the puzzle, reconstructing the events of that night, the investigation and the breakthrough that eventually led to Westerm's arrest. One of the key tasks of the prosecution was to translate complex scientific evidence into a language understandable to the jury. DNA evidence, while often considered conclusive, is inherently technical. Prosecutors worked carefully with experts to explain the principles of DNA matching, statistical probabilities, and steps taken to prevent contamination or error. Visual aids, diagrams, and simplified explanations were used to help jurors understand the meaning of evidence without overloading it with jargon. The defense cross-examined these experts, carefully examining the inconsistencies, challenging the assumptions, and emphasizing the novelty of the investigation methods used. They sought to remind jurors that science, despite its power, is not infallible, that every laboratory process has the right to error, and that every research tool, no matter how advanced, must be scrutinized. Throughout the trial, there was considerable tension in the courtroom. Reporters filled the ranks of the press. Family members of both the victim and the accused sat quietly, listening attentively. Public interest was high, fueled by a widespread discussion about genetic privacy and the growing role of DNA in criminal justice. The last arguments unsettled the case. The prosecution called on the jury to consider the weight of the evidence: DNA match, physical evidence, time frame, lack of any credible alternative suspect. They painted a picture of a man who had eluded justice for decades, but was eventually exposed by science. The defense, for its part, challenged the prosecution's version at every step. They interviewed forensic experts, questioning the methods used and identifying the possibility of laboratory error or contamination. They argued that reliance on genetic genealogy raises ethical questions and suggested that the novelty of the method introduces an unacceptable level of uncertainty. They reminded the jury that no one had seen Westerm at the crime scene, no murder weapon had been found, and the crime had remained unsolved for so long precisely because the initial investigation had failed to find concrete evidence. During the trial, the jury listened attentively. They were shown photographs from the crime scene, listened to hours of technical testimony, and listened to emotional statements from survivors of the Jeanie family. While the science was compelling, the human factor was no less powerful. Jurors were reminded that at the center of the case was a young woman who had been brutally murdered and a family who had been denied justice for too long. The latter arguments crystallized the rates. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the weight of the forensic evidence, arguing that the DNA match is conclusive and that Westerm's defense is nothing more than speculation. The defense, by contrast, cautioned against relying too heavily on scientific evidence without corroboration of facts, suggesting that the prosecution was built on probabilities rather than certainty. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours, which is surprisingly short given the complexity and length of the trial. When they returned with the verdict, a tense silence reigned in the courtroom. The brigadier stood up and pronounced a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree murder. For the Jeanie family, the verdict was a moment of deep, complex emotion. Of course, there was relief that the man they believed to be the perpetrator of their sister's murder was brought to trial. There was gratitude to the investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts who worked tirelessly to bring this case to an end. But there was also a sadness, a deep and enduring sadness for the years lost, the missed opportunities, and the lives that had been so cruelly cut short. Jerry Westerm was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is the maximum penalty under Minnesota law for first-degree murder. He had been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and now his future was determined by the cold, hard walls of the prison cell. This case was a milestone for the legal system, a testament to the power of forensics, the importance of preserving evidence, and the continued commitment of law enforcement to solving even the most complex cases. It underscores the fact that justice, although often delayed, can still prevail. And it gave hope to the families of other victims, reminding them that no matter how many years have passed, the quest for accountability never ends.